The desert heat was already building at 0600 hours, but inside the Gulf Command briefing room, the industrial air conditioning kept the temperature bone cold. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Hayes sat 3 rows from the back, her chair, the only one without a nameplate. Around her, officers from 6 different nations filled seats marked with laminated cards, bearing their country's flags and unit designations. Royal Air Force, Emirati Tactical Wing, U.S. Navy Strike Fighter Squadron. Her chair simply read, Observer. Rebecca's flight suit was standard Navy issue, faded from countless wash cycles. No custom patches adorned her shoulders, no unit insignia proclaimed her achievements. Just a worn nameplate that read, Hayes, R, and the ghost outline where her Tomcat Squadron patch used to be before the program was officially retired. In her lap sat a thick binder filled with tab pages and protocol, sheets that most pilots her age had never seen. The briefing officer, a polished lieutenant colonel named Marcus Webb, tapped his control panel and lowered the projection screen. As the satellite image of the Gulf corridor filled the wall, he began reading the roster aloud with practiced efficiency. U.S. Navy Strike Fighter Squadron 12, Royal Air Force Squadron 15, Emirati Tactical Wing 3. His voice carried the smooth cadence of someone who'd done this briefing dozens of times. When he reached the final page, he paused slightly, glanced toward Rebecca's row, and read without looking at her. Embedded Observer, United States Navy Exchange Program Officer, Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Hayes. The pause said everything. She was an afterthought, a bureaucratic checkbox. A pilot in the second row, wearing gleaming Gulf State insignia, leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something that made both men chuckle. From across the aisle, a U.S. Navy commander adjusted his seat and muttered just loud enough for several people to hear. Didn't know they still had any Tomcat drivers left. The snickers that followed weren't malicious, just dismissive. Rebecca kept her expression neutral, her fingers steady against the binder. She'd heard worse. The briefing continued with call sign assignments and airspace allocations. Modern Super Hornets and sleek F-16s were given primary escort routes and active radar responsibilities. Rebecca's aircraft, labeled Escort Delta II, appeared on the chart with a footnote. Support asset. Radar passive. Weapons safe. Translation: she was flying a museum piece with no real purpose except to fill a formation slot. When the briefing covered visual identification protocols, Rebecca raised her hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Lieutenant Colonel Webb actually stopped mid-sentence. Will the legacy signal package be included in visual fallback procedures, or are we defaulting to standard light codes only? She asked, her voice calm and professional. Webb blinked, looking genuinely confused. We don't use the old signals anymore. This is a fully digital theater. All protocols have been updated to current standards. Understood, Rebecca replied, lowering her hand. She didn't speak again for the rest of the briefing. Several heads turned, some amused, others puzzled. The old-timer asking about outdated procedures. How quaint. As the briefing ended and chairs scraped against the floor, Rebecca stood in silence. Her thumb traced the edge of a page in her binder, a section marked with a small triangular fold. The page was titled Pre-Engagement. Visual Signals, Revision 4 Delta. Most of the text was faded from age, but she knew every word by heart. She'd studied it because someone had to remember what others had forgotten. Outside in the corridor, the morning sun cast harsh shadows through the windows. Other pilots gathered in small groups, discussing the mission over coffee and energy bars. Rebecca walked past them toward the flight line, her boots silent on the polished floor. She had nothing to prove to them, but she carried something they'd lost, the knowledge that sometimes the oldest tools were the most important ones. The hangar smelled of jet fuel and hot metal. Her 14 Tomcats sat apart from the sleeker, newer aircraft, its gray paint faded, but its lines still sharp and purposeful. The crew chief, a weathered petty officer named Danny Rodriguez, was already running pre-flight checks. "Morning, Commander," he said without looking up from his clipboard. "She's ready to fly. Hydraulics are good, engines are solid, and I've got your back seat configured for observation only." Rebecca nodded, running her hand along the Tomcat's wing. The aircraft was older than half the pilots on this base, but it was reliable. More importantly, it was hers. "Any word from the tower about our slot?" she asked. Rodriguez shrugged. "You were last in the formation sequence. They want the modern birds up front for the show." Of course they did. Rebecca wasn't surprised. She'd been flying these missions for 3 months, always in the back, always quiet, always forgotten. But she'd also been watching, learning, noticing things that others missed. As she climbed into the cockpit and began her startup sequence, Rebecca felt the familiar thrum of the Tomcat's engines coming to life. The sound was deeper than the newer jets, more primal. It reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. Today's mission was supposed to be routine. A formation flight over international waters, testing coordination between allied forces. Nothing complicated, nothing dangerous. But Rebecca had read the intelligence reports. She knew about the rising tensions in the region, the increasing number of misunderstandings between different air forces. She'd seen the subtle changes in body language during briefings, the way certain pilots avoided eye contact with others. Something was building out there. She could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, in the nervous energy that crackled through the radio chatter during pre-flight checks. As she taxied toward the runway, Rebecca opened her binder one more time. The page with the triangular fold caught the morning light streaming through her canopy. 5 degrees down, hold for 3 seconds, then level off. A simple gesture that meant false lock, stand down. She'd practiced the maneuver dozens of times. Alone in her quarters, moving her hands through the motion until it became muscle memory. Not because she expected to use it, but because she believed in being prepared for anything. The tower cleared her for takeoff. Rebecca advanced the throttles and felt the Tomcat surge forward, its powerful engines pushing her back into her seat. As the aircraft lifted off the runway and climbed into the pale morning sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. She was right. 22,000 feet above the Gulf, the formation looked perfect from the outside. 4 aircraft in precise alignment, their contrails drawing straight lines across the blue sky. But inside the cockpits, tension was building like pressure. In a boiler, Rebecca flew in the rear right position, her Tomcat's older radar painting a fuzzy picture compared to the crystal-clear displays in the newer jets. She watched the formation through her heads-up display, noting how the spacing between aircraft had subtly changed over the past 15 minutes. The lead aircraft, piloted by Major Kevin Thompson in a Super Hornet, held steady at the formation center. To his left, Captain Ahmad Hassan in a Gulf State F-16 maintained perfect distance and altitude. But Rebecca's trained eye caught the micro-adjustments, the tiny corrections that spoke of underlying stress. "Escort Delta 2, confirm your position," came Thompson's voice over the radio, crisp and professional. "Delta 2 in position," Rebecca replied, keeping her tone neutral. It was only the second time anyone had addressed her directly since takeoff. The first sign of trouble came as a brief tone on her threat detection system. A half-second blip. That registered on her older equipment, but apparently nowhere else. Rebecca frowned, adjusting her display settings. The tone repeated, slightly longer this time. "Gulf 1, confirm all locks are simulated." Thompson's voice carried a new edge. I'm reading active ping signatures. Captain Hassan's reply came, after a pause that lasted just a heartbeat too long. Negative hostile lock, SIM package only, as briefed. But Rebecca saw Hassan's festina twitch to the left, a movement too deliberate to be random. She'd seen that maneuver before, during her early training. It was a defensive reposition, the kind pilots made when they felt threatened. Golf 1. Say again your status. Thompson pressed. I'm showing hard contact on my scope. System malfunction. Hassan replied, but his voice was tighter now. Running diagnostics. Rebecca watched the formation begin to deteriorate. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger an emergency, but she could see the signs. The way Thompson's Super Hornet drifted higher, gaining an altitude advantage. The way Hassan's wingman, Captain Rashid Alawi, adjusted his heading to support. His leader. Her threat detection system chirped again, and this time, Rebecca recognized the pattern. She'd seen it before, buried in the technical manuals that nobody read anymore. It was a handshake failure, a glitch that occurred when different. Radar systems tried to identify each other using incompatible protocols. Not hostile, not a real threat. Just a technological hiccup that modern pilots weren't trained to recognize. Rebecca keyed her radio, then hesitated. She wasn't part of the tactical frequency. According to the briefing, her job was to observe and report, not to intervene. But she could see what was happening, and the others couldn't. Golf 1, Golf 1. Visual contact. Hassan's voice crackled through the static. American flight. Confirm your weapons status. Weapons safe. SIM. Only, Thompson replied, but Rebecca could hear the strain in his voice. Golf 1. You are drifting out of formation. Advise intentions. The Gulf State F-16 banked harder now, a clear defensive maneuver. From her position behind the formation, Rebecca could see both aircraft beginning to position themselves for potential engagement. Neither pilot was backing down. Her hands moved to the radio controls, then stopped. The chain of command was clear. She was an observer, not a participant. Her voice carried no authority in this situation, but her aircraft did. Rebecca looked down at her binder, still open to the page with the triangular fold. The faded text seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight. Wing dip 5 degrees indicates false lock alert. Stand down. She'd never used a signal in combat. Hell, she'd never seen anyone use it. But she'd studied it, practiced it, and most importantly, she understood what it meant. The formation was seconds away from complete breakdown. Two allies, separated by language barriers and technological incompatibility, were about to turn a training exercise into an international incident. Rebecca made her decision. She eased her right wing down, exactly 5 degrees. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to trigger a formation violation. Just a precise, deliberate movement that she held for exactly 3 seconds before leveling off. For a moment, nothing happened. The radio chatter continued, voices getting more heated. By the second. Then, suddenly, Hassan's F-16 straightened out. Golf 1. Contacts resolved, Hassan announced, his voice calm again. System reset complete. Returning to formation. Copy that, Golf 1, Thompson replied, relief evident in his tone. Formation integrity restored. Rebecca said nothing. She simply adjusted her throttle and slipped back into her assigned position. The crisis was over, and officially, nothing had happened. But she'd been seen. As the formation settled back into its proper alignment, Rebecca caught a glimpse of Hassan's aircraft. The pilot's helmet was turned slightly in her direction, and she could swear she saw a brief nod of acknowledgement. Someone had remembered the old signals after all. The rest of the flight passed without incident. Radio chatter returned to normal, professional coordination calls mixed with routine system checks. When they landed back at the base, The official report would list a brief radar echo delay and standard formation realignment. No one would mention the 5-degree wing dip. No one would note the moment when disaster was averted by a gesture most pilots had never learned. But Rebecca knew. And more importantly, she knew that someone else had seen it too. As she taxied back to the hangar, Rebecca felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. She'd done her job, even if it wasn't the job she'd been assigned. She'd prevented an incident using knowledge that others had dismissed as obsolete. The Tomcat's engines wound down with their characteristic whine. Rebecca sat in the cockpit for a moment longer, watching the other aircraft taxi to their packing spots. The pilots would debrief, file their reports, and move on to the next mission. And she would continue to fly in the back, forgotten and underestimated. But she would also continue to watch, continue to remember, continue to carry the knowledge that others had lost. Because someone had to. The debrief room felt like a tomb, all concrete walls and fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical interference. Rebecca entered last, as always, carrying her helmet by the chin strap. The other pilots were already seated, their voices a low murmur of post-flight discussion. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stood at the front of the room, adjusting the digital display that would show their flight data. Behind him, the wall-mounted screen flickered to life, displaying altitude readings, formation tracks, and radar signatures from their mission. "Standard debrief, gentlemen," Webb announced, not bothering to acknowledge Rebecca's presence. "Clean flight, no incidents. All aircraft performed within parameters." Rebecca took her usual position at the back of the room, standing rather than sitting. She'd learned that sitting in the back row made her effectively invisible during these sessions. Standing, at least, gave her a clear view of the proceedings. The playback began with their takeoff sequence. White lines traced across the screen, showing each aircraft's path through the sky. Time codes ticked by in the corner, marking each second of their flight. Formation integrity was maintained throughout, Webb noted, his laser pointer dancing across the display. Minor spacing adjustments were well within acceptable parameters. Rebecca watched the screen carefully. The moment of crisis appeared. As a subtle shift in the formation pattern, Hassan's F-16 showed a brief deviation, followed by Thompson's altitude adjustment. To anyone not familiar with tactical maneuvering, it would look like routine formation maintenance. But then Webb paused the playback. He frowned, backing up the footage by several seconds. "What's this?" he muttered, pointing to a section of the display. Escort Delta II shows a wing angle deviation at time hack 97 minutes, 43 seconds. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. There it was, plain as day on the official record. Her 5-degree wing dip, captured in precise detail by the formation's tracking systems. A voice spoke from the front row. Captain Hassan, his Gulf State uniform crisp despite the day's heat, leaned forward in his chair. His eyes were fixed on the screen, studying the telemetry data with intense concentration. "That's the signal," he said quietly. The room fell silent. Webb looked confused, his laser pointer wavering. "What signal?" Hassan didn't answer immediately. He was older than most of the pilots in the room, probably in his late 40s, with gray threading through his dark hair. His uniform bore the marks of someone who'd been flying for decades, not just years. "Wing dip, 5 degrees, 3-second hold," Hassan said, his English careful but clear. "It's an old NATO signal, Cold War era." Webb's confusion deepened. "We don't use those signals anymore. They were discontinued in the 80s. "Yes," Hassan agreed. "But some of us still remember them." Rebecca felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She kept her expression neutral, her hands steady at her sides. She wasn't about to confirm or deny anything. Major Thompson, who'd been silent until now, shifted in his seat. "I've never heard of any wing dip signal. What's it supposed to mean? Hassan's gaze moved from the screen to Rebecca, then back to the screen. False lock alert. Stand down. The words hung in the air like smoke. Webb looked from Hassan to Rebecca, then back to the display. The implications were slowly sinking in. Are you saying, Webb began carefully, that Commander Hayes was signaling a false lock situation? I'm saying, Hassan replied, that at the moment shown on your screen, my aircraft was experiencing a radar malfunction that was being interpreted as a weapons lock. And at that same moment, someone in this formation used a signal that I was taught to recognize 30 years ago. Rebecca remained silent. She could feel the tension in the room shifting, the way a weather front changes the pressure in the air. Lieutenant Colonel Webb looked uncomfortable. This wasn't the simple debrief he'd expected. Commander Hayes, he said finally, do you have anything to add? No, sir, Rebecca replied. I maintained formation integrity throughout the flight, as instructed. Technically, it was true. She'd never broken formation, never deviated from her assigned role. The wing dip had been subtle enough to avoid triggering any safety protocols. But Hassan wasn't finished. May I ask, he said, addressing Rebecca directly, where you learned that signal? Rebecca met his gaze steadily. I study old manuals, sir. I believe in being prepared for any situation. Old manuals, Hassan repeated, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Yes, I imagine there are many things in the old manuals that people have forgotten. The room erupted in quiet conversation. Pilots leaned toward each other, discussing the implications of what they'd just heard. Webb looked like he wanted to end the debrief and file the whole incident away. But Rebecca could see that something had changed. The way Hassan looked at her was different. The way Thompson studied the playback footage showed new respect. Even the younger pilots seemed to be reassessing their earlier dismissive attitudes. The debrief continued for another 20 minutes, covering fuel consumption and system performance. But the energy had shifted. Rebecca was no longer invisible. She was the pilot who'd prevented an incident that could have made international headlines. When the session finally ended, Rebecca gathered her helmet and moved toward the door. As she reached the exit, Hassan fell into step beside her. Commander Hayes, he said quietly, might I have a word? She paused, looking at him carefully. Of course. They walked outside together, into the late afternoon heat. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Other pilots streamed past them, heading for the mess hall, or their quarters. I learned those signals in Jordan, Hassan said, his voice barely above a whisper. 1986. My instructor was an old American pilot, a veteran of Vietnam. He said they might save my life someday. Rebecca nodded, but didn't speak. Today, Hassan continued, I think he was right. My radar was malfunctioning, showing your Major Thompson as a hostile contact. I was preparing to break formation and call for backup when I saw your wing dip. It was just a minor course correction, Rebecca said carefully. Hassan smiled. Of course it was, but it was a very precise course correction, executed at exactly the right moment. They walked in comfortable silence for a few more steps. Then Hassan stopped, turning to face her. They have forgotten much, these younger pilots, he said. They rely too heavily on their computers, their digital systems. They don't understand that sometimes the old ways are the best ways. The old ways aren't always popular, Rebecca replied. No, Hassan agreed, but they are sometimes necessary. Thank you, Commander Hayes, for remembering. As he walked away, Rebecca stood alone in the desert twilight. The crisis was over, the incident avoided. But she knew this was just the beginning. Word would spread, quietly, but surely. The pilot who'd prevented an international incident with a gesture most people had never heard of. She wasn't invisible anymore. And that she realized might be the most dangerous thing of all. The knock on Rebecca's door came at 2200 hours, soft but insistent. She wasn't surprised. She'd been expecting this conversation since the debrief ended 6 hours ago. Captain Hassan stood in the hallway, his flight suit replaced by civilian clothes. He looked tired but alert, his eyes scanning the corridor before settling on her face. "May I come in?" he asked. Rebecca stepped aside, gesturing him into her small quarters. The space was Spartan but organized. A narrow bed, a metal desk, a locker against the far wall. On the desk, her binder lay open to the page with the triangular fold. Hassan noticed it immediately. He approached the desk slowly, his eyes taking in the faded text and hand-drawn diagrams. "May I?" Rebecca nodded. Hassan sat down and began reading, his lips moving silently as he absorbed the technical details. After several minutes, he looked up at her. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Archives," Rebecca replied. "I spent 3 months in the Pentagon basement, going through boxes of discontinued manuals. Most of them were scheduled for destruction." Hassan turned the page carefully, studying the next section. "This is remarkable. I had no idea these protocols were so detailed." "Most people don't," Rebecca said. "The transition to digital systems made everyone forget the analog backup procedures." Hassan found the section on visual signals and stopped. His finger traced the diagram showing the 5-degree wing dip. "This is exactly what my instructor taught me, but I never saw it written down. It was classified until 1995, Rebecca explained. Even after declassification, most copies were destroyed to make room for newer materials. But you saved them. Someone had to." Hassan continued reading, occasionally asking questions about specific procedures or signal variations. Rebecca found herself explaining the historical context, the reasons why certain protocols had been developed, the combat situations that had made them necessary. "You know," Hassan said after a while, "I've been flying for 24 years. I've worked with pilots from a dozen different countries, but I've never met anyone who understood the old systems like you do." "It's not a popular specialty," Rebecca admitted. "Most pilots want to focus on the latest technology, the newest weapon systems. Studying obsolete procedures doesn't advance your career." "No," Hassan agreed, "but it might save lives." They talked for another hour, comparing notes on signal protocols and formation techniques. Hassan shared stories from his early career, when miscommunication between allied forces was a constant danger. Rebecca described her research into Cold War aviation history, the incidents that had been covered up or forgotten. "There was a situation over the Baltic in 1983, Hassan said. Soviet interceptors challenged a NATO training flight. The Americans couldn't communicate with the British. The British couldn't reach the Germans. If not for one pilot who knew the old hand signals, it could have started a war. That's why I study this stuff," Rebecca said. "Technology fails. Radios break. Computer systems get jammed. But if you know the basic signals, you can communicate with anyone." Hassan nodded thoughtfully. "Today, when I saw your wing dip, I knew immediately what it meant. But I wonder, how many other pilots would have recognized it?" "Not many," Rebecca admitted. "Maybe a few old-timers, veterans who learned the signals during the Cold War. But they're retiring every year. Soon, there won't be anyone left who remembers. Unless someone teaches them." Rebecca looked at him carefully. "What are you suggesting?" Hassan closed the binder and leaned back in his chair. "I'm suggesting that knowledge this valuable shouldn't be lost. There are young pilots on this base, good pilots, who could benefit from learning these techniques." "Unofficially, you mean?" "Of course. The official curriculum is set by committees in Washington and Riyadh. But there's nothing stopping experienced pilots from sharing their knowledge during off-duty hours." Rebecca considered this. The idea had merit, but it also carried risks. Teaching unauthorized procedures could be seen as insubordination, especially if something went wrong. It would have to be very quiet, she said finally. No official documentation, no reports to headquarters. Naturally, just a few experienced pilots sharing techniques with interested colleagues. They shook hands on it, a simple gesture that felt like the beginning of something important. Hassan left shortly after, but not before copying down several key reference numbers from Rebecca's binder. Over the next few days, Rebecca noticed subtle changes in the way people treated her. Pilots who'd previously ignored her now nodded when they passed in the corridor. During mission briefings, officers occasionally asked for her input on formation protocols or communication procedures. The change was gradual but unmistakable. She was no longer the invisible observer in the back row. She was the pilot who'd prevented an incident, the one who remembered things others had forgotten. But with recognition came scrutiny. Lieutenant Colonel Webb started paying closer attention to her reports, asking pointed questions about her methods and sources. During flight assignments, he began pairing her with different pilots, seemingly at random. Rebecca suspected she was being tested. Someone higher up the chain of command wanted to know more about the pilot who'd used an obsolete signal to defuse a potential crisis. The real test came a week later, during a joint exercise with British and French units. The weather was rough, with low clouds and intermittent radio interference. Rebecca found herself flying wing to a Royal Air Force, a hurricane pilot who seemed determined to prove that American pilots couldn't keep up with European standards. Midway through the exercise, the British pilot's radio failed completely. He was cut off from the formation, unable to receive instructions or coordinate with the other aircraft. In the old days, this would have been a minor problem. But the current generation of pilots had never learned to fly without constant radio contact. Rebecca watched the British pilot's aircraft begin to drift away from the formation. He was trying to maintain visual contact, but without radio guidance, he was slowly losing position. She made her decision quickly, using a series of wing movements. And heading changes, Rebecca began signaling the British pilot. Turn left, climb, resume formation. The signals were basic, derived from the same manual she'd shown Hassan. It took several minutes, but eventually the British pilot understood. He began following Rebecca's lead, matching her movements and maintaining proper formation position. When his radio finally came back online, he was exactly where he needed to be. After landing, the British pilot sought Rebecca out. "That was brilliant flying," he said, his accent crisp and professional. "Where did you learn those signals?" "Old manual," Rebecca replied. "Cold War era. Remarkable. I've never seen anything like it. Would you be willing to teach me?" Rebecca smiled. "I might know someone who could help with that." The meeting took place in an abandoned briefing room at the far end of the base, long after the official duty day had ended. Rebecca arrived first, carrying her binder and a thermos of coffee. The room smelled of dust and old paper, its walls lined with outdated charts and faded photographs of aircraft that had been retired decades ago. Captain Hassan arrived next, followed by the British pilot, squadron leader James Morrison. Behind them came Major Thompson, looking slightly uncomfortable but curious. A few minutes later, two more pilots slipped in quietly. Lieutenant Sarah Kim from the Korean Air Force and Captain Lucas Rodriguez from the Spanish contingent. 7 pilots. In total, representing 6 different nations. All experienced, all respected within their units. All united by a growing understanding that something important was being lost. "I want to be clear about something," Rebecca began, addressing the small group. "What we're discussing here is not official training. It's not part of any recognized curriculum. It's simply experienced pilots sharing knowledge with colleagues." Morrison raised his hand. What exactly are we talking about? I mean, I saw what you did during the radio failure, but I don't understand the full scope. Rebecca opened her binder to the first page. Visual communication protocols. Hand signals, wing movements, formation gestures. Techniques that were developed during World War II and refined during the Cold War. Why aren't these taught anymore? Asked Lieutenant Kim. Because, Hassan replied, modern aircraft have sophisticated communication systems. Digital radios, data links, satellite connections. The assumption is that pilots will always be able to talk to each other. But systems fail, Thompson added. I've seen it happen. Radios go down, jamming interferes with signals, weather blocks transmissions. Exactly, Rebecca said. When technology fails, you need backup procedures. The old signals aren't obsolete. They're insurance. She spent the next hour walking them through the basics. Simple wing movements that indicated direction changes. Formation adjustments that could be communicated without words. Emergency signals that could save lives when radios failed. The pilots were quick learners. Morrison, with his Royal Air Force background, picked up the formation signals immediately. Kim's precision flying made her a natural at the subtle wing movements. Rodriguez asked detailed questions about the historical context, wanting to understand not just how the signals worked, but why they'd been developed. This is fascinating, Thompson said during a brief break. I've been flying for 15 years, and I never knew any of this existed. Most pilots don't, Rebecca replied. It's not their fault. The institutional knowledge has been lost as the old-timers retired. But you preserved it, Hassan observed. You went looking for it when no one else cared. Rebecca shrugged. I was curious. I wanted to understand how pilots communicated before we had all this electronic equipment. They practiced for another hour, using hand gestures and body language to simulate the signals they'd use in actual flight. The movements felt awkward at first, but gradually became more natural. When do we try this in the air? Morrison asked. Carefully, Rebecca replied. We don't want to interfere with official exercises or cause any safety concerns. But there are opportunities, training flights, maintenance checks, solo practice sessions. Over the following weeks, the informal network began to expand. Each pilot brought trusted colleagues, carefully selected for their professionalism and discretion. The group grew to include nearly 20 pilots from 8 different countries, all united by a shared interest in aviation history and practical skills. They met irregularly, always in unofficial settings. Sometimes it was a quick conversation over coffee. Other times it was a formal presentation in an unused classroom. The knowledge spread organically, passed from pilot to pilot like a chain. Off whispered secrets. Rebecca found herself at the center of this quiet revolution. Pilots sought her out for advice, asking about specific procedures or historical context. She became a teacher without a classroom, an instructor without official authority. But her new role didn't go unnoticed. Lieutenant Colonel Webb began asking pointed questions about her activities. During flight assignments, he started pairing her with pilots she'd never worked with before, seemingly to test her methods. Commander Hayes, he said after one mission briefing, I've been hearing interesting reports about your educational activities. Rebecca kept her expression neutral. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. Pilots discussing obsolete procedures. References to discontinued manuals. Your name comes up frequently in these conversations. I enjoy studying aviation history, sir. If other pilots find it interesting, that's their choice. Webb studied her carefully. Just make sure your historical interests don't interfere with current operations. We follow modern procedures for a reason. Of course, sir. But Rebecca could see the writing on the wall. Her activities were being monitored, her influence noted. It was only a matter of time before someone higher up the chain of command decided to take action. The crisis came sooner than expected. During a routine training exercise, a miscommunication between American and German pilots nearly resulted in a mid-air collision. The incident was minor, but it triggered a comprehensive review of all training procedures. Rebecca found herself called to a meeting with the base commander, Colonel Patricia Hendricks. The colonel was a no-nonsense officer with 30 years of experience and a reputation for running a tight ship. "Commander Hayes," Hendricks began, "I've been reviewing your activities on this base. It seems you've been conducting unauthorized training sessions. I've been sharing historical knowledge with interested colleagues, ma'am, using outdated procedures that aren't part of our current training regimen." Rebecca chose her words carefully. "I've been discussing techniques that might be useful in emergency situations where modern systems fail." Colonel Hendricks leaned back in her chair. "Let me be clear about something. This base operates under strict protocols. We use approved procedures, certified training materials, and standardized communication systems. We don't experiment with obsolete techniques from the Cold War." "Yes, ma'am." "However," Hendricks continued, "I've also been reviewing the incident reports from the past month. There have been 3 situations where quick thinking and unconventional problem-solving prevented more serious problems. In each case, the pilots involved had been exposed to your historical research." Rebecca remained silent, waiting for the colonel to continue. "I'm not going to order you to stop your educational activities," Hendricks said finally, "but I am going to make them official. You'll report to the training division starting next week. Your job will be to develop a supplemental curriculum covering emergency communication procedures." Rebecca felt a surge of unexpected relief. "Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be a lot more work than your informal study groups. You'll need to document everything, create training materials, and justify every procedure you want to include." "I understand." "Good, because if this works, we'll be implementing it across the entire command. And if it doesn't work, you'll be flying a desk for the rest of your career." As Rebecca left the colonel's office, she felt both excited and terrified. Her quiet network of aviation historians was about to become an official training program. The knowledge she preserved was going to be taught to a new generation of pilots. But with official recognition came official scrutiny. Every procedure would be questioned. Every technique would be tested. The informal atmosphere of shared learning was about to give way to the rigid structure of military training. The old signals were about to become new again. And Rebecca Hayes, the invisible pilot who'd been forgotten in the back row, was about to become one of the most important instructors on the base. The training division conference room was packed beyond capacity. Pilots from every unit on the base filled the seats, with more standing along the walls. Rebecca had never seen so many people interested in a training presentation. Colonel Hendricks stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past month, we've had several incidents where quick thinking and unconventional problem-solving prevented serious problems. Today, we're going to formalize some of these techniques." She gestured toward Rebecca, who stood beside a projection screen displaying the first slide of her presentation. "Commander Hayes has been researching emergency communication procedures, focusing on situations where modern systems fail. Today, she's going to share some of her findings." Rebecca stepped forward, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. In the front row, she could see Captain Hassan and Squadron Leader Morrison, both offering encouraging nods. Major Thompson sat in the third row, his expression serious but interested. "Thank you, Colonel," Rebecca began. "What I'm going to show you today isn't new. These are techniques that have been used by military pilots for 70 years. But in our rush to embrace digital technology, we've forgotten some fundamental skills." She clicked to the next slide, showing a grainy photograph of World War II fighter pilots. When these men flew over Europe, they had no satellite communications, no digital data links, no computer displays. They stayed alive by watching each other, by understanding a common language of gestures and movements. A young pilot in the back row raised his hand. But why do we need this stuff? Our radios work fine. Rebecca had expected this question. Lieutenant, how many times in the past year have you experienced radio failure during flight? The pilot thought for a moment. Maybe twice. And what did you do when it happened? I followed standard procedures. Return to base, maintained. Visual separation from other aircraft. What if you were in a combat zone? What if returning to base wasn't an option? What if you needed to coordinate with wingmen who couldn't hear you? The lieutenant's confident expression faltered slightly. Rebecca could see understanding dawning in his eyes. She spent the next 30 minutes walking through basic visual signals. Wing dips for course corrections. Formation adjustments for altitude changes. Hand gestures visible through cockpit windows for simple communication. But the real demonstration came when she reached the slide showing the 5-degree wing dip. This signal, she said, pointing to the diagram, means false lock alert, stand down. It was developed during the Cold War when radar systems were less reliable and misidentification was a constant threat. Major Thompson leaned forward in his seat. Is this the signal you used last week during the Gulf exercise? Rebecca nodded. Captain Hassan's radar was malfunctioning, showing false target signatures. The standard response would have been to break formation and request backup. But that could have escalated into a serious incident. Instead, Hassan said, standing up in the front row, Commander Hayes used a signal that immediately told me the contact was false. Crisis averted with a simple wing movement. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Several pilots were taking notes, while others leaned toward their neighbors in quiet discussion. Colonel Hendricks stepped forward. This is exactly the kind of thinking we need to encourage. Modern systems are excellent, but they're not foolproof. Having backup procedures could prevent misunderstandings that might escalate into larger problems. The questions came rapidly after that. Pilots wanted to know about specific scenarios, historical examples, practical applications. Rebecca found herself fielding inquiries about everything from night operations to electronic warfare environments. The key thing to remember, she emphasized, is that these signals supplement modern procedures. They don't replace them. You still use radio first, data link first, digital systems first. But when those fail, you have alternatives. The presentation lasted 2 hours, with an additional hour of questions and discussion. By the end, Rebecca could see a fundamental shift in the room's energy. Pilots who'd entered skeptical were leaving energized, eager to learn more. But not everyone was convinced. As the crowd dispersed, Rebecca noticed Lieutenant Colonel Webb lingering near the exit, his expression troubled. He caught her eye and gestured for her to approach. Commander Hayes, he said quietly, that was an impressive presentation. But I have concerns about implementing these procedures without extensive testing. What kind of concerns, sir? Safety concerns. These signals haven't been used operationally in decades. We don't know how they'll interact with current flight protocols. What if pilots misinterpret a signal? What if someone uses the wrong gesture at the wrong time? Rebecca had anticipated this objection too. That's why we start with training. Sir, controlled environments, experienced instructors, gradual implementation. We don't just throw people into combat with new procedures. Webb nodded slowly. I understand the logic, but I want extensive documentation of every phase. Testing reports, safety evaluations, pilot feedback. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Of course, sir. As Webb walked away, Rebecca felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. She'd achieved something remarkable: official recognition for knowledge that had been dismissed as obsolete. But she'd also committed herself to a process that would be scrutinized at every level. Over the following days, Rebecca found herself buried in paperwork. Every signal had to be documented. Every procedure had to be justified. Every historical example had to be verified. The informal study sessions she'd enjoyed were replaced by formal training modules and official evaluation criteria. The first group of volunteer pilots began training the following week. 20 experienced aviators from various nations, all eager to learn the old signals. Rebecca worked with them in small groups, starting with basic wing movements and progressing to more complex formation communications. The volunteers were enthusiastic, but careful. They practiced each signal dozens of times on the ground before attempting it in flight. They asked detailed questions about timing, positioning, and interpretation. They understood that they were not just learning new techniques. They were helping to validate a training program that might be implemented across the entire command. Captain Hassan proved to be an excellent assistant instructor. His experience with the signals, combined with his natural teaching ability, made him invaluable during the practical sessions. Squadron leader Morrison brought a different perspective, focusing on the integration of visual signals with standard Royal Air Force procedures. But it was Major Thompson who provided the most surprising support. Despite his initial skepticism, he threw himself into the training with characteristic intensity. He practiced the signals until they became second nature, then helped design evaluation criteria for other pilots. "You know," he told Rebecca after one particularly intensive session, "I never thought I'd be interested in this historical stuff. But there's something powerful about these techniques. They're simple, reliable, and they work regardless of technology." "That's the beauty of them," Rebecca replied. "A wing dip means the same thing whether you're flying an F-14 or an F-30-5. The real test came during a joint exercise with Canadian forces. Rebecca's volunteers were integrated into mixed formations, flying alongside pilots who knew nothing about the visual signals. The goal was to see how the techniques worked in realistic conditions. The results exceeded expectations. When a Canadian pilot's radio failed during a complex formation maneuver, Lieutenant Kim was able to guide him back into position using wing signals. During a simulated emergency, Morrison used hand gestures to coordinate with pilots who spoke limited English. Most importantly, there were no incidents. No misunderstandings, no safety violations, no confusion. The old signals worked exactly as advertised. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. During the exercise debrief, the Canadian squadron commander approached Rebecca with a puzzled expression. "Commander Hayes," he said, "I need to ask you about something. Our pilots reported seeing some unusual flight patterns during today's exercise. Wing movements that seemed intentional but weren't part of standard procedures." Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. Had they been too obvious? Had the signals been misinterpreted as unauthorized maneuvers? "Can you be more specific, sir?" The Canadian officer smiled. "My father was a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force during the Cold War. He taught me some old signals when I was learning to fly. I think your pilots were using techniques that haven't been seen in 20 years. Rebecca relaxed slightly. "We've been researching historical communication procedures." "Well, you've done excellent research. Those signals potentially prevented what could have been a serious incident. When our pilot's radio failed, your people knew exactly how to help him. It was like watching pilots from different eras working together seamlessly." As the Canadian officer walked away, Rebecca felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The knowledge she'd preserved, the techniques she'd taught, had passed their most important test. They worked in the real world, under pressure, when lives could depend on clear communication. The invisible pilot who'd been forgotten in the back row was no longer invisible. She was becoming the architect of a training revolution that would influence how pilots communicated for years to come. But with success came new challenges. Word of the program was spreading beyond the base, attracting attention from higher levels of command. Rebecca knew that soon she'd be explaining her methods to generals and admirals who might not share Colonel Hendrick's appreciation for historical innovation. The quiet network of aviation enthusiasts was about to become something much larger and more complex. And Rebecca Hayes was about to discover whether her preserved knowledge could survive the scrutiny of the military bureaucracy. The conference room in the Pentagon felt like the center of the world. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Potomac River, while the walls displayed photographs of military aircraft spanning 8 decades of aviation history. Rebecca sat at a polished mahogany table surrounded by generals, admirals, and civilian officials whose combined years of service could be measured in centuries. At the head of the table sat General Patricia Morrison, the Air Force Chief of Staff, her 4 stars gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To her right was Admiral James Rodriguez, representing naval aviation, and to her left sat Dr. Elizabeth Thompson from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Rebecca had been summoned to Washington after word of her training program reached the highest levels of military command. What had started as informal study sessions on a remote base had evolved into something that caught the attention of people who made policy for the entire Department of Defense. "Commander Hayes," General Morrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We've been following the reports from your base with considerable interest. Your emergency communication program has achieved some remarkable results." "Thank you, ma'am," Rebecca replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. However, Admiral Rodriguez interjected, "We have concerns about implementing unproven procedures across the fleet. These signals you've been teaching, they're not part of current doctrine for a reason." Dr. Thompson leaned forward, consulting a tablet covered with data charts. "Our analysis shows significant risk factors: pilot confusion, misinterpretation of signals, potential conflict with existing procedures. The liability issues alone are staggering." Rebecca had prepared for this moment, but facing the combined scrutiny of the military's highest leadership was more intimidating than she'd expected. She opened her briefing folder and pulled out a thick stack of documentation. "With respect, sir, ma'am," she began, "the data tells a different story. Over the past 2 months, we've conducted 47 training flights using visual communication protocols. 0 incidents, 0 safety violations, and 3 documented cases where the signals prevented potential problems." General Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Tell us about those 3 cases." Rebecca flipped to a marked section of her notes. The first incident involved a radar malfunction during a joint exercise with Gulf state forces. Standard procedures would have required formation breakdown and potential escalation. A simple wing signal resolved the situation immediately. The second incident occurred during severe weather operations. Radio jamming prevented normal communication between American and British pilots. Visual signals allowed them to maintain formation integrity until communications were restored. The third incident involved a mechanical failure in a Canadian aircraft. The pilot's radio was inoperative, but wing signals enabled his formation to guide him safely back to base. Admiral Rodriguez studied the reports she distributed. "These are impressive results, Commander, but they're also limited in scope. How do we know these techniques will scale up to fleet-wide implementation?" "Because they already have, sir," Rebecca replied. "These signals were used by thousands of pilots during World War II and the Cold War. They're not experimental. They're proven techniques that we stopped teaching for convenience, not because they didn't work." Dr. Thompson looked up from her tablet. But that was a different era. Modern aircraft operate in a much more complex electromagnetic environment. Today's pilots rely on sophisticated communication systems that didn't exist 50 years ago. Which is exactly why we need backup procedures, Rebecca countered. The more complex our systems become, the more vulnerable they are to failure. Electronic warfare, jamming, equipment malfunction, all of these threaten our ability to communicate. General Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying Rebecca with the calculating gaze of someone who'd seen countless briefings over the years. Commander, let me ask you a direct question. Why did you start researching these procedures in the first place? Rebecca considered her answer carefully. Because I was tired of being helpless when technology failed, ma'am. I've experienced radio failures, computer malfunctions, and system crashes. In every case, I had to rely on luck and improvisation instead of established procedures. So you went looking for those procedures? Yes, ma'am. I spent months in archives, reading manuals that were scheduled for destruction. I found techniques that had been tested in combat, proven effective, and then forgotten. And you decided to preserve them. Someone had to. The room fell silent for several moments. Rebecca could hear the distant hum of air conditioning and the muffled sounds of traffic from the street below. She'd laid out her case as clearly as possible. Now the decision rested with people whose choices affected millions of military personnel. Around the world, General Morrison finally spoke. Admiral Rodriguez, what's your assessment? The Admiral consulted his own notes. From a naval perspective, these techniques could be valuable for carrier operations. When you're launching aircraft in radio silence or dealing with electronic countermeasures, visual communication becomes essential. Dr. Thompson remained skeptical. I still have concerns about training standardization. How do we ensure that? A signal means the same thing to an American pilot and a NATO ally. The same way we ensure that radio procedures are standardized, Rebecca replied. Through coordinated training and common doctrine. These signals were developed as international standards during the Cold War. The protocols already exist. General Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out over the river. The afternoon sun reflected off the water, creating patterns of light that shifted with the current. Commander Hayes, she said without turning around, you've presented a compelling case, but implementing this program would require significant resources. Training development, instructor certification, equipment modification. We're talking about millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours. Yes, ma'am, Rebecca acknowledged. But the cost of not having these capabilities could be much higher. If we lose communication during a critical mission, the consequences could be catastrophic. That's a fair point, Admiral Rodriguez agreed. We've seen too many incidents where simple miscommunication led to serious problems. General Morrison returned to her seat. Here's what we're going to do. You'll have 6 months to develop a comprehensive training program. Full documentation, standardized procedures, instructor guidelines. If you can prove that these techniques can be safely integrated into current operations, we'll consider fleet-wide implementation. Rebecca felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet, the general warned. This will be the most scrutinized program in recent military history. Every procedure will be questioned. Every result will be analyzed. Every instructor will be evaluated. If there's even one serious incident, the program ends immediately. I understand. Dr. Thompson looked up from her tablet one final time. Commander, you'll be working with a team of experts from across the Department of Defense. Engineers, psychologists, training specialists, safety analysts. They won't all share your enthusiasm for historical procedures. I'm prepared for that, Rebecca replied. As the meeting ended and the officials filed out, General Morrison lingered behind. She approached Rebecca with an expression that was hard to read. "Off the record, Commander," she said quietly. "I think what you're doing is important." The military has a tendency to discard old knowledge in favor of new technology. Sometimes we throw away things we shouldn't. Thank you, ma'am. But understand this, you're betting your career on these signals. If this program fails, you'll be remembered as the pilot who wasted millions of dollars on obsolete procedures. If it succeeds, you'll be the officer who revolutionized military communication training. As Rebecca left the Pentagon and walked through the Virginia afternoon, she reflected on the enormous responsibility she'd just accepted. The quiet research project that had started in a basement archive was about to become a major military initiative, affecting pilots around the world. She thought about Captain Hassan, Squadron Leader Morrison, and all the other pilots who'd embraced the old signals with enthusiasm and respect. They believed in the knowledge she'd preserved, trusted in the techniques she'd taught. Now she had to prove that their faith was justified. The invisible pilot who'd been forgotten in the back row was about to become one of the most visible officers in the entire military. The old signals were about to get their biggest test yet. 2 years later, Rebecca stood once again in a briefing room, but this time the setting was dramatically different. The International Aviation Training Center in Nevada hosted pilots from 23 nations, all gathered to learn what had become known as the Silent Wing Protocol. The room buzzed with conversation in a dozen languages. American pilots sat beside German aviators, while Japanese instructors compared notes with Brazilian squadron leaders. In the front row, Captain Hassan, now Major Hassan, chatted with Squadron Leader Morrison, who'd been promoted to Wing Commander after successfully implementing the visual signals across the Royal Air Force. Rebecca had changed too. The faded flight suit and worn nameplate had been replaced by dress blues adorned with ribbons that told the story of her transformation, from forgotten observer to recognized innovator. The Legion of Merit gleamed on her chest, awarded for exceptional service in developing critical emergency communication procedures that have enhanced aviation safety across multiple allied nations. But the most significant change wasn't visible on her uniform. It was the confidence in her posture, the authority in her voice, the way other pilots looked at her with respect and attention. She was no longer invisible. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the international audience. 3 years ago, most of you had never heard of visual aviation signals. Today, these techniques are standard training for pilots in 14 countries and counting. The presentation screen behind her showed statistics that still amazed her. Over 4,000 pilots trained in silent wing protocols. 63 DOCUMENTD cases where the signals had prevented incidents or resolved emergencies. 0 accidents attributed to signal confusion or misinterpretation. The success of this program proves something important, Rebecca continued. Old knowledge doesn't become worthless just because it's old. Sometimes the most reliable techniques are the ones that have been tested by generations of pilots who flew in conditions we can barely imagine. A French pilot raised his hand. "Commander, Hayes, how do you respond to critics who say these signals are unnecessary in the age of satellite communication?" Rebecca smiled. It was a question she'd heard many times before. "Colonel Dubois, how many times in the past year have you experienced communication failure during flight?" The French pilot considered for a moment. "Perhaps 4 or 5 times. And what would have happened if you'd needed to coordinate with wingmen during those failures?" "I would have relied on standard hand signals and formation flying, which are exactly what we're teaching here, Colonel. Standardized, internationally recognized hand signals and formation movements. The only difference is that now all allied pilots learn the same signals instead of improvising their own." The training demonstration that followed had become the highlight of these international sessions. Pilots from different countries took turns using visual signals to coordinate complex maneuvers without saying a word. Wing dips, formation adjustments, emergency communications, all executed with precision and clarity. Major Thompson, now serving as Rebecca's deputy instructor, narrated the demonstration. Notice how Lieutenant Yamamoto from Japan and Captain Mueller from Germany are maintaining perfect coordination despite having no common language except these visual signals. The audience watched in fascination as the two pilots guided each other through a simulated emergency landing, using nothing but wing movements and hand gestures. When they completed the exercise and taxied to a stop, the briefing room erupted in spontaneous applause. But the real validation came during the afternoon question and answer session. A veteran Russian pilot, Colonel Mikhail Petrov, stood and addressed Rebecca directly. "Commander Hayes," he said in heavily accented English, "I must tell you something. Last month, my squadron was conducting exercises with Norwegian forces in Arctic conditions. Severe weather caused complete radio failure for nearly 30 minutes. The room fell silent, understanding the implications immediately. Arctic flying conditions were among the most dangerous in the world, where communication failure could quickly become fatal. Using signals I learned in your program," Petrov continued, "I was able to coordinate with the Norwegian pilots and guide the formation safely to an alternate airfield. Without these techniques, we might have lost aircraft." The impact of his words rippled through the audience. This wasn't theoretical anymore. These signals were saving lives in real-world situations. After the formal session ended, Rebecca found herself surrounded by pilots eager to share their own experiences. A Canadian aviator described using the signals during a search and rescue operation. An Australian instructor explained how she'd incorporated them into her country's flight training curriculum. A young American pilot thanked Rebecca for teaching him techniques that had helped him communicate with Allied forces during his first overseas deployment. As the crowd gradually dispersed, Rebecca walked outside into the Nevada desert sunset. The air was clear and still, with the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the forgotten observer in the back row to the architect of an international training revolution. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Major Hassan, who was now serving as a liaison officer in Jordan, saw the news coverage of today's session. "The old signals are making headlines around the world. Your instructor from 1986 would be proud." Rebecca smiled, remembering the elderly pilot who taught Hassan the wing dip signal all those years ago. The knowledge had passed from instructor to student, from one generation to the next, preserved by people who understood its value, even when others dismissed it as obsolete. A gentle breeze stirred the desert air, carrying the distant sound of aircraft engines from the training flights still underway. Somewhere out there, pilots from different nations were practicing the signals she'd helped preserve and modernize. They were learning to communicate without words, to coordinate without radio chatter, to maintain formation bonds that transcended language barriers. The next morning brought news that validated everything Rebecca had worked toward. The Secretary of Defense announced that silent wing protocols would become mandatory training for all military pilots, with implementation beginning immediately across all branches of service. The press release described it as a revolutionary approach to aviation safety that combines historical wisdom with modern training methods. Reporters called it the most significant advance in pilot communication since the invention of radio. But for Rebecca, the real measure of success wasn't found in headlines or official announcements. It was in the emails from pilots around the world, sharing stories of how the signals had helped them in unexpected situations. It was in the reports from training commands, documenting improved coordination between international units. It was in the knowledge that future generations of pilots would never again be helpless when their radios failed. That evening, Rebecca returned to her quarters and opened the same binder she'd carried for years. The pages were more worn now, marked with additional notes and cross-references from pilots around the world who'd contributed their own knowledge to the growing collection. She turned to the page with the triangular fold, the one that had started everything. The diagram of the 5-degree wing dip was now accompanied by detailed annotations in multiple languages, each one representing a pilot who'd learned the signal and understood its importance. At the bottom of the page, someone had written in small, careful letters, "Knowledge preserved is hope maintained." Rebecca didn't know who'd written those words, but they captured exactly what she'd been trying to accomplish. In a world of rapidly advancing technology and constantly changing procedures, some things remain constant. The need for clear communication, the importance of backup plans, the value of knowledge that had been tested by time and proven reliable under pressure. She closed the binder and placed it on her desk, next to a new folder labeled Advanced Silent Wing Protocols. There was always more to learn, more techniques to rediscover, more knowledge to preserve. Outside her window, the Nevada stars shone with brilliant clarity in the desert air. Somewhere in that vast sky, pilots were flying missions that demanded the highest levels of skill and coordination. Thanks to the signals Rebecca had helped preserve, they would never be truly silent. They would always have a way to communicate, to coordinate, to watch out for each other. The invisible pilot had become visible not through self-promotion or political maneuvering, but through the simple act of preserving knowledge that others had forgotten. She'd reminded the world that sometimes the most important innovations came not from looking forward, but from remembering what came before. In the end, that was her greatest achievement. Not the awards or recognition, not the headlines or official programs, but the knowledge that pilots around the world could communicate when words failed them. They could coordinate when technology abandoned them. They could maintain the bonds of formation flying that had kept aviators alive for generations. Rebecca Hayes had started as the pilot nobody noticed, flying in the back with no voice in the formation. She'd ended as the instructor everyone remembered, the officer who taught the world to speak without words. The old signals lived on, passed from instructor to student, from generation to generation. And somewhere in the sky, pilots were using wing dips and hand gestures to tell each other the most important message of all: I'm watching out for you. That was the legacy of the silent wing, not just preserved knowledge, but preserved trust. The understanding that even in an age of digital communication and satellite technology, the most important conversations often happened without saying a word. The invisible pilot had become unforgettable, and her signals would echo through the sky for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.